an aging autocratic leader of a large country that traces its heritage back to communism, and in the midst of fighting a demographic crisis, invades a once culturally similar but now democratic neighbor in order to forestall growing Western cooperation in the region and to secure his own historical legacy as an all-time great president. Now, it sounds like I am referring to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but what I was really describing is potentially the world's next major war, an invasion of Taiwan by China. Yes, the war in Ukraine has become the single biggest geopolitical event of the decade, and is reorienting the international system from the top to the bottom. Yet a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would threaten to put all of that to shame, making Ukraine versus Russia look like a trivial regional conflict, as it turns the entire world into an economic wasteland. And given all of those aforementioned similarities to Russia, there is seemingly endless discussion about whether a war could occur, how the United States would play into all of this, and what can be done to reduce the possibility of international pandemonium. And yet, so much that surrounds the conflict is misunderstood, from what causes wars in the broadest sense, to China's desire to capture Taiwan's semiconductor industry, to why the United States would want to intervene to protect Taiwan, it's actually not that, to whether China has the numbers necessary to pull off the feat, to the destruction of dams, to why exactly demographics are working against China, and to how nuclear weapons will shape the conflict. Welcome to What Everyone Gets Wrong About War Between China and Taiwan. Prologue. Faultlines. Our story begins with the breakpoint between Taiwan and what is colloquially called China. That is, what divides the two polities, and I do not mean the literal division of the Taiwan Strait. Flashback to 1949. After decades of civil war between the Nationalists and the Communist Party of China, the latter's People's Liberation Army had the upper hand and began raising its red flag across the mainland. Seeing no other choice, the Nationalists retreated to the island of Taiwan. Thus began the modern era of conflict between the two parties. Chiang Kai-shek of the Nationalists and Mao Zedong of the Communists never signed a peace treaty, nor have any of their successors. And thus, technically speaking, the two sides remain at war, with the Republic of China still claiming sovereignty over the entire mainland, and the People's Republic of China still claiming sovereignty over the island of Taiwan. In the decades since, politicians and celebrities alike have tripped all over themselves to say that there is but one China, even if we cannot find a consensus on the correct flag. It is also why the United States does not have an embassy in Taiwan, just an institute. And it is why Taiwan uses that weird flag and is called Chinese Taipei during the Olympics. Very few are left on the island who can remember the retreat. Over the decades of isolation, Taiwan has developed a distinct culture and unique Mandarin accent to match. Indeed, social identity has drifted over the decades, where by 2023, 61.7% of citizens identified themselves as strictly Taiwanese, and those who identified themselves as strictly Chinese, just 2.4%. Rewind the clock back to just 1992, and it was 25.5% Chinese and 17.6% Taiwanese. Coupled with that is a lack of desire to reunite with the mainland, particularly under the PRC's banner. Taiwan has observed the experiments of the handover of Hong Kong from British to Chinese control in 1997, and then Macau from Portugal in 1999, and the island is not exactly itching to join that club. The KMT, the political party of Chiang Kai-shek, promotes the One China idea, but has lost ground in recent years. Instead, the DPP, which promotes greater Taiwanese diplomatic standing, has won the last 3 presidential elections. Correspondingly, this has led to more departures from the One China conventions over recent years, and greater military tensions. The first of these occurred on December 2nd, 2016, when President Tsai Ing-wen placed a phone call to the then President-elect Donald Trump. High-level contact like this was commonplace in the 1950s and the 1960s, but had vanished after Washington normalized relations with Beijing. Regardless, the call excited Trump and paved the way for more interactions. Trump signed the Taiwan Travel Act on March 16, 2018. The bill created the guidelines for officials to travel between the two polities. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi took advantage of that in August 2022 by leading a congressional delegation to the island. President Tsai returned the favor by visiting Speaker Kevin McCarthy in California on April 5, 2023. Then came a new Taiwanese president and a U.S. congressional delegation to wish the new administration well. It went great, as you can see. Oh, and in between, we have had things like chance encounters between vice presidents at third country inaugurations. But with those events have come increased military tensions. Immediately after Pelosi's departure from Taiwan, the PLA spent the next 4 days engaging in live fire exercises in 6 zones around the island. A year later, a U.S. Navy destroyer traveling in the international waters of the Taiwan Strait was cut off by a PLAN vessel, coming within 140 meters of a collision. Meanwhile, China has taken the street grid surrounding Taiwan's presidential building and copied and pasted it in the Mongolian desert, ostensibly as a training ground for a future invasion. More drama followed Lai Ching-te's inauguration in May 2024. Oh, he also goes by William, indicating his excellent taste in first names. However, Beijing was not as impressed as I am, and celebrated the transition of power with yet more drills. Various news reports claim that Xi has set equally various target dates for such a war, and during a 2023 summit with Biden, he warned that the mainland would indeed reunify with Taiwan. For its part, Taiwan is preparing for such a contingency, passing 1-year mandatory military service in January 2024, though it featured a built-in delay until 2026. And the US Navy has been squarely focused on preparing for that theater of combat, even while the rest of the world's attention turned to the hot war in Ukraine. Chapter 1. The War Puzzle. With apologies for taking an academic segue, the problem with all of those takes is that none of them provides a coherent explanation for war. To continue with the pattern of astonishing facts, a war between China and Taiwan would be incredibly costly, both in terms of blood and in terms of treasure. All sorts of treasure. And as frightening as those figures are, the good news is that their very possibility encourages the parties to negotiate a peaceful resolution instead. In fact, this is why political scientists point out that substantive disagreements, for example, sovereignty over Taiwan, do not explain why wars occur. Rather, you need both a substantive disagreement and a bargaining friction to get there. Have one, but not the other, and you get peace instead. Let me explain with some good old-fashioned lines on maps. The One China debate is essentially a manifestation of coercive bargaining, with Beijing on one side and Taipei plus its allies on the other side, all fighting over Taiwanese sovereignty. Thus, we must abandon the lines on territorial maps that we have come to know and love in Ukraine, and instead think about more amorphous lines on a sovereignty scale over with Taiwan. Taipei, of course, would like to be completely unencumbered by the CCP's influence. In contrast, Beijing would prefer if the island had no sovereignty at all. That is, it became a province of the People's Republic. The problem for Beijing is that achieving that goal either requires the consent of Taipei or an invasion of the island. The former is not about to happen, and the latter is risky. Such an invasion may or may not be successful, and it is hard for anyone to know in advance what will happen, just like a roll of the dice. If we average out all of the potential outcomes of a war, from a Taiwan win and full autonomy, to a mainland takeover and no sovereignty, and all of the various types of stalemates that might occur in between, then we can get this white line to represent Taiwan's expected post-war sovereignty. Now, I do not know exactly where this line is in practice, and to be frank, none of us do, unless maybe you are watching this video from here, in which case, please get back to work. However, it turns out that the precise location does not matter for what I am going to say next. Remember, fighting to obtain that outcome is bad for both parties because of how expensive that process would be. Because of this, wherever the expected outcome may be, Taiwan is willing to negotiate away some portion of sovereignty to avoid that suffering, say by this much. Let's draw a red line to keep track of it. Meanwhile, by the same token, the PRC is willing to concede Taiwan declaring some portion of greater sovereignty, say by this much, again because war is costly for the mainland too. This time, we'll use a yellow line to keep track of it. The key insight here is that a range of political situations is better for both parties than fighting a war. Now, no one is particularly happy with such compromises. Again, Taiwan ideally wants full autonomy, and Beijing ideally wants no autonomy at all for the island. But war is even worse than settling within this bargaining range, and trying to force either of those outcomes does not work, because the other side would prefer to fight instead. As a result, the game that we observe being perennially played by Taiwan is trying to figure out exactly how far the island can go without blowing up everything. It is the One China principle in the form of lines on maps. There has been no declaration of independence, because Taiwan realizes that making one might set off Beijing, and compromising in this manner is better than suffering the costs of war. This is one of the many things that the common narratives of the cross-strait conflict miss. They assume that wars happen purely because there is a substantive disagreement between the two parties, rather than being a combination of that plus a bargaining friction. Thankfully, though, the costs of war encourage parties to negotiate instead. And if we as a collective are indeed worried that war will break out, we first need to articulate what the bargaining friction is that will soon create the problem. Otherwise, we become like doctors trying to cure a disease that we have not yet diagnosed. Chapter 2: The Rise of China. For most of 21st century geopolitics, concerns about war with China stemmed from the country's incredible economic growth. Indeed, China is nothing short of an economic miracle. Beginning in the 1970s, China transitioned to a market economy, or what its leadership terms socialism with Chinese characteristics. Whatever the label, China's export-oriented growth strategy, combined with its massive 1 billion-plus population, created an economic powerhouse. In 1981, Chinese citizens living in the extreme poverty of under $2.15 per day accounted for almost 92% of its population. By the end of the millennium, that figure had dropped to 46%. Leap forward to the critical year of 2017, and it descended to almost nothing. The reason that year is so important, though, is due to China's economy as a whole. Back in 1981, the United States accounted for more than 21% of global GDP in terms of purchasing power parity. China, in contrast, was only a fraction over 2%. Head back to the critical year of 2017, though, and they flip-flopped. China had become the world's largest economy. This did not go unnoticed. As Washington moved on from the George W. Bush administration's forays in the Middle East, concerns grew of a rising China in the Far East. You see, modern military power is largely a function of money. Have more cash, and you can build more big fancy weapons, which you can then use to coerce your rivals. The plan fit perfectly into the Deng Xiaoping-era application of the ancient hide your strength and bide your time philosophy. But the hiding and the biding could not continue forever. And after decades of economic growth, defense analysts in the United States began awaiting China to take those critical second and third steps. Heading back to our lines on maps, this creates significant strain on the bargaining environment. Before, the expected outcome was just a snapshot in time, but that can change. If this is indeed the path that the PRC takes, then it tells us that the military balance between Taiwan and the PRC will shift in the PRC's favor. As a result, a hypothetical best feasible outcome for Taipei might move to here. Again, that's the future. But the question is what Taiwan should do about this in the present. Indeed, forcing the issue in the moment may be better than this later outcome, even accounting for Taiwan's costs, and what extra it may be able to extract out of the PRC at a later date. Now, as tempting as it would be to chalk this up to some abstract academic theory, the truth is that when they were not joking around about basketball, a rising China was a central concern during the Obama years. More explicitly, the worry was that China one day may decide to use its power to reshape the world, leading to questions of what might need to be done in the contemporary present to stop it. However, Washington lacked a simple solution at the time. You see, the Obama administration was still beholden to the legacies of Afghanistan and Iraq, so the official reorientation to China within the US government had to wait. Jumping ahead, there was indeed a Trump-era shift. This was formalized by the 2018 National Defense Strategy, of which Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Elbridge Colby was the chief architect. Now fast forward again to the Biden administration. Public and proximate attention shifted back to Russia for obvious reasons, but Biden's policy regarding China did not change much. China is still the long-term main event that occupies much of the foreign policy establishment's time, even if we do not hear much about it. However, due to radical changes occurring inside of the Chinese mainland, the exact nature of the problem has evolved into something much, much more concerning. Chapter 3: The Decline of China. It seems strange to follow a chapter about the rise of China with the instant decline of China, at least from a demographics perspective. It seems even stranger that Washington followed obsessive concern about the rise of China causing a war, with an even more obsessive concern about the decline in China causing a war. But here we are. It was a 1-2-3 punch that ultimately turned the tables. Rewind to World War II. An estimated 15 to 20 million people died from the military campaigns, and other things that are less pleasant to look at than dogs. Of course, other countries also took great losses from the war, but many of them were blessed with baby booms thereafter. China was not one of those. Rather, the country was cursed with the aforementioned continuation of its civil war, and that meant more pain. The follow-on fight did not finish for another 4 years, and not until at least a couple million more were lost. Then you would hope that there would finally be a baby boom, and things would somewhat balance out. But, sorry, your hopes would be dashed. From 1959 to 1961, China experienced the Great Famine. Its cause? Principally, and ironically, the Great Leap Forward campaign launched the previous year. This could be a long video of its own. The entire thing was a mess. But that said, it basically replaced effective agricultural methods with ineffective ones. And then there were the classic mistakes of trying to eradicate pest sparrows, ostensibly because sparrows eat stored grain. However, China quickly discovered that those sparrows also ate locusts, and locusts were a much bigger problem for crop growth. Add another 15 to 55 million dead to the total. Makes war look quaint. Now, that might seem like a ridiculous range, but it is hard to tally the total loss of life when malnutrition is part of the cause, and the government deliberately outlawed doctors assigning starvation as a cause of death, as part of the political cover-up. Anyway, in light of those losses, the CCP desperately wanted to have China's population start making babies. Well, the plan worked. The 1950s and 60s saw great expansion at the bottom of the population pyramid. The very bottom here from 1964 is particularly ridiculous, and the last hurrah in 1968 saw an equally ridiculous fertility rate of 6.3 births per woman. Back then, 2.2 or so was the replacement rate. The mainland was almost 3 times past that. The CCP realized that it now had the opposite problem on its hands, wondering whether China had the resources to handle such explosive population growth over such a short period of time. Thus began the early 1970s later, longer, fewer campaign. Later entrance into marriage, longer times between children, and fewer children overall. But this was like trying to use a band-aid to stop a carotid artery from bleeding. It does not work like that. By the end of the decade, later, longer, fewer gave way to the better-known one-child policy, which broadly limited couples to, you guessed it, one child. It's a very descriptive name, even if it came with many exceptions. Anyway, that is part 1 of the demographic crisis. Part 2 was a consequence of it. If you know that you are going to be limited to one child, and have a strong preference to have a boy and not a girl, this weird thing happens where girls magically go missing. At the start of the one-child policy in 1980, for every one girl born, about 1.05 boys were born. That was well within what the World Health Organization considers normal. By 2002, though, that ratio had gone up to an astounding 1.21 boys for every girl. Short term, the problem is that a number of terminated pregnancies never see the mother conceive again. Long term, the problem is visually evident. When you have 5 boys for every 4 girls, you run into a problem when it is time to get married. Indeed, by 2021, there were 3 surplus marriage-aged men, with a 5 and 6 zeros tacked on. And those 35 million men were also not having children. Part 3 is an ironic consequence of what gave rise to China in the first place: money. It is a story that anyone in an industrialized country is familiar with. The people get rich, women start entering the labor force, the opportunity cost for having children goes up, and thus the number of babies born every year goes down. That is how you end up with fertility rates in 2022 like 1.67 in the United States, 1.57 in the United Kingdom, 1.33 in Canada, and 1.26 in Japan. Remember that quaint 6.3 fertility rate in China from 1968? Yeah, recently it dropped to 1.18. Sure, China is beating South Korea, but that is not much of an accomplishment. At least that is what the World Bank thinks is the correct figure. Chinese state media actually reported an even worse number. Now, it is possible to cheat the system, have below replacement fertility rates, and still grow your population. All you need is a little immigration. That's how the United States, despite its 1.67 fertility rate, still adds a couple of million people or so per year. In contrast, would-be immigrants are not exactly clamoring to get passports from an autocratic government. Consequently, China's population actually declined in 2023 by a couple 100,000. In turn, we have reached the point that the CCP is once again desperate to convince its citizens to conceive more babies. And the one-child policy? Overturned in 2016 and replaced with the two-child policy. And the two-child policy? Overturned in May 2021 and replaced with the three-child policy. These steps have mitigated but not reversed the problem. In 2017, China's fertility rate briefly spiked to 1.70, likely as a part of what we might call pent-up demand. Think about families that always wanted to have a second child, but never could because of the policy. Well, then the policy ended, and so they scrambled to have that extra child. But unfortunately for the CCP, all of those extra babies are now born, and the signs are still pointing to a further decline in the mainland's birth rates. The last time that something like this happened, it was no big deal. In the 1980s, Japan's roaring economic growth was supposed to propel it to the top of the world's fiscal food chain. Indeed, there was an unease in the United States that this would be the end of the American century, until Japan hit an almost identical demographic problem. The key moment happened earlier than with China, because Japan simply lost World War II, and, despite the manner of its loss, then went back to business, without a civil war or famine in between. Thus, its population peaked earlier, as did its economic rise. This all happened without military consequence, because Japan subscribes to the liberal world order, and so rising or falling compared to others hardly mattered when the United States would guarantee the status quo. In contrast, the PRC has Taiwan, and, more precisely, wants Taiwan. Chapter 4. Invasion Plans. There is a good chance that you are thinking to yourself, hey, wait a minute. Why does China's waning population even matter? It is still huge, and Taiwan is still small. And you know what? You are right. To draw this to scale, Taiwan has a population of 23 million. Meanwhile, China has a population of 1.4 billion. It is David versus Goliath. But to better appreciate the problem here, we need to talk about what an invasion of Taiwan might actually look like. The first problem is getting there. This is not a simple situation where you drive across a border. Rather, a whole Taiwan Strait stands in the way. Now, it might seem like a basic waterway that ranges between 140 and 220 kilometers wide, but the reality is more complicated. A presidential visit to Taiwan's weather center is not just for the fun photo op. It is a vital part of national security. Indeed, the Taiwan Strait is infamous for being one of the worst places to navigate in the world. During the winter, it is high winds and rough seas, and later fog. During the summer, these apparently pristine waters give way to a monsoon season. Combined together, PLA strategists can only reliably plan an invasion for April or October each year, and Poseidon help the PRC if an April or October invasion lasts a few months. Now, there is some chance that the PLA will dispense with the idea of a sea-based invasion, and try to build an air bridge instead. But we have seen the difficulty of accomplishing that with the Battle of Hostomel Airport at the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The defender can sabotage the runway and invalidate the entire strategy. Stuff gets destroyed, yes, but the country does not immediately fall to the invaders, and your capital remains safe. Thus, most military strategists focus on how an amphibious landing would unfold, which brings a new emphasis to the People's Liberation Army Navy, and yes, that is its real name. Such an operation would be massive. History's largest amphibious landing, so far, occurred on June 6, 1944. Establishing a beachhead is no simple task, and we all know how much blood was shed during the Normandy landings on D-Day. In fact, it still gets world leaders to visit there annually to commemorate the Allied losses, and there were a lot of them. But an assault on Taiwan would make Normandy look like a pleasant walk on the beach by comparison. Obviously, step one is physically moving upwards of 1 million PRC troops to the island. The PLAN does not even have enough ships to do that, so this would require commandeering civilian vessels. Think of it as the evacuation of Dunkirk, but in reverse. Of course, no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and Taipei certainly hopes that no plan survives first contact with Taiwan. The incoming naval vessels will be visible to everyone, so Taiwan will rain fire from the skies on them. This is why the PRC has invested so much in its ballistic missile program, to target Taiwan's land-based anti-ship batteries, so that PRC ships can reach shore safely. It is also why the corruption scandal involving the PRC's rocket force became such a big deal. If they do not work, then Taiwan's missiles get free rein. Whatever ships do survive the initial barrage will then have to get lucky navigating seaborne minefields. These will run kilometers deep, and Taiwan will have plenty of time to lay them, given that it might take more than a month for the PRC to stage the invasion. Now, if the PRC somehow gets past all of that and fights through Taiwan's navy, then there is the question of where to actually land. You see, Taiwan only has a handful of deep-water ports, and like any airfields in danger, we can bet that Taiwan will sabotage those as well. Thus, option 1 for the PRC is the direct approach of attacking Taiwan's west coast. The problem here is that there may be a kilometer or more of shallow waters on approach, preventing larger landing ships from getting close, and giving a long distance for the less shielded landing ships to traverse. Option 2 is to approach from the east. This already looks unattractive because it adds hours to the trip, and then promptly welcomes the invading troops with steep cliffs. Good luck scaling them while facing enemy fire. And yet, making landfall is only the first step of a much more complicated process. Taiwan has gone on a spending spree to increase its chances during a traditional land-based phase of the war, with requests from US suppliers from top to bottom. During the Biden administration alone, Taiwan placed $5.4 billion in arms orders. A very non-exhaustive list of purchases from the last decade include Switchblade 300s, MQ-9 Reapers, M136 Volcano mine layers, Harpoon missile defense systems, Stinger man-portable air defense systems, F-16Vs, M1 Abrams tanks, and of course HIMARS, because everyone wants HIMARS now thanks to its results from the war in Ukraine. And they are coming with ATACMS rockets, which have more than enough range to fly across the Taiwan Strait. Of course, the PRC would like to end things early before any of that mattered, say via one of those decapitation operations its forces have been practicing. But that would first require penetrating into Taipei, and it just so happens that various mountain ranges make the number of plausible entries into the city very few. Worse yet for the PRC, even if Taiwan's central government somehow falls, the eastern coastal cliffs from earlier hint at the vast mountain ranges that sit behind them, which, despite the island's small size, somehow peak at almost 4,000 meters. That matters. Anyone paying attention to Afghanistan over the years knows that mountain ranges are the perfect place to stage an insurgency. And while all of this is happening, the Chinese mainland will remain more than 100 kilometers away, specifically across the strait's choppy waters, complicating how the PLA invasion force will sustain its operations. Consider for a moment all of the logistical difficulties that Russia has encountered during its invasion of Ukraine. And, by comparison, simply getting things into Ukraine is as difficult as driving across the border. It is for all of those reasons that when the United States was island hopping during World War II, GIs showed up to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and then took one look at Taiwan and said hard pass. In contrast, today, will the PRC take the opposite approach? Chapter 5: Demographic Deficit. The central lesson from the previous chapter is that invading Taiwan would be a gigantic mess. Yes, the island is small, but successfully capturing it would require one of the world's largest mobilizations in history. In other words, the PRC would need a whole mess of humanity to be successful. And that is where the previously discussed demographic shifts come into play. Take a look at this population pyramid from 2024. Usually, we think of the potential soldier pool as males, ages 18 to 40 or so. Consequently, there are tons of available PLA draftees right now. But look down here. The babies and toddlers of the mainland are a rare breed. There are about as many of them as there are people in their early 60s. Remember, that's the cohort that the Great Famine decimated. And keep in mind that there have been 6 decades of other deaths that have further dwindled their numbers. But back at the pyramid's base, at some point, these babies will become the new basis of the PLA. And then Beijing will have to reconsider the feasibility of invading Taiwan. Now, yes, the PRC's population is way larger than Taiwan's population, and that is not going to change over time. In fact, as bad as the PRC's fertility rate is, Taiwan's is somehow marginally worse, which would seem to incentivize Beijing to defer an invasion to a later date. But the problem is that the PRC and Taiwan do not live in their own little universe. For Beijing, the problem is that China's borders are far from settled. The most well-known of these issues are the various islands and zones of economic rights in the South China Sea that Beijing claims, but basically everyone else disputes. Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Then, just north of Taiwan are the Senkaku Islands, which adds Japan to the list of opposition. Ironically, these are some of the few things that Beijing and Taipei agree on. It is one China after all, so they are united in the belief that these territories are all Chinese, but still disagree on which China we are referring to. Meanwhile, India has all sorts of disputes with the PRC over their shared land border, including one that also brings in Bhutan. Beyond those, many of the PRC's other neighbors have resolved territorial disputes, including Kazakhstan, Pakistan, and Russia. But resolved in international relations means resolved with an asterisk. They are subject to change given the right circumstances. Beyond that, things are not exactly calm within the PRC itself, with potential for rebellion in Tibet, the home of the Uyghurs, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong. All told, this will force Beijing to hold back some of its troops to keep the other countries and localities honest. Places like Vietnam and India are not facing the same level of demographic crisis that the PRC is, meaning that it will become more difficult for Beijing to storm the beaches of Taiwan and balance the other issues in the future. And it is not like the PRC can skimp out on its invasion force. Taiwan has about 169,000 active duty soldiers. Traditional military doctrine would tell you that an invading army should deploy at least a 3-to-1 numerical advantage over the defender. This is because the attacker is the one that must take the active steps, and so the defender can use entrenchments as a force multiplier. Taiwan's extreme geographic advantages indicates that 3-to-1 would be an aggressive strategy for Beijing, so let's bump it up to 5-to-1 and see what happens. To match Taiwan at that level, the PRC would need 845,000 troops, more than 40% of Beijing's active personnel. But then again, there is literally nowhere for the Taiwanese people to go in the event of an invasion. We are talking about an island here, and conceivably one under a blockade, meaning that the entire country will shift to a war footing once an invasion begins. This is the benefit of not having a billion potential antagonists. You can focus all of your resources on one opponent. Thus, every reservist will pick up their instruments of war once again. Those instruments of war, which will add another 1,660,000 to the fold. Do the multiplication again, and quickly the number of troops that Beijing would need to mobilize gets out of hand. And that is ignoring anyone else who might pick up a weapon when the time comes. There's a lot of others on the island. It still looks pretty bad for Beijing, even if you stick to the standard 3-to-1 ratio. Of course, these are back-of-the-envelope calculations. And if you are watching from Beijing, first of all, ni hao. But second, you probably do not want to be planning your invasion with the help of a YouTube channel. The overarching point, though, is that 1. Invading Taiwan will require a ton of soldiers, and 2. The bilateral headcounts are not going to get much better over time. Meanwhile, trying to execute an invasion a generation later, with a population pyramid projected to look like this, while simultaneously supporting an increasingly top-heavy retired class that back in the early 2000s had 10 workers to support a single retiree, but will fall to just 2 by 2050, while simultaneously balancing other interests abroad and at home, and never mind that we have not yet broached the possibility that someone else might intervene. That may just be too much. What we are left with is the reverse of the concerns during the Obama years. The mainland's military capacity is still on the rise, but its trajectory is not looking good. Its power will soon peak, and then begin to fall off. Thus, a war now may be expected to hold Taiwan down to, say, here, but eventually the expected outcome will jump up to, say, here. Even the costs of war might not be able to save the parties from a cataclysm. To ground this idea, it is possible that we have seen the logic of demographic deficits play out too recently. One explanation for why the Kremlin chose to invade Ukraine is because of Russia's own dwindling birth rate. You see, Control over Ukraine was always something on the Kremlin's wish list. But as Russia's population fell off and pension payments became more burdensome, threatening to invade Kyiv became increasingly less practical. The PRC invading Taiwan would just be the next iteration of that. And the discussion has become more focused within US policymaking circles. The biggest media splash came in January 2023, when a leaked memo from Air Force General Mike Minahan warned that his gut told him that there would be war with China come 2025. Other reports focus on 2027, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Liberation Army. Regardless of the exact year, though, it appears that time is ticking. Chapter 6. But would they really? That last chapter sounded quite grim, but let's take a step back for a second and think more about this. Those headlines about war plans and expectations, it turns out that generals like to tell their soldiers, hey, you should prepare for war. That kind of thing is in their job description. Also, the whole thing about creating war plans to coincide with auspicious dates, it turns out that real military planners are more concerned about, actually winning a war, rather than having it align with some circle on a calendar. That's right. Lines on maps are more important than circles on planners. Indeed, this is why we keep hearing things about Russia having major plans for its May 9th Victory Day celebrations, only for rumors to go nowhere year after year. Of course, leaders may nonetheless manipulate conflict timing when there are pressing political concerns. Goodness knows we have discussed how elections distort war strategy to no end. But they are not doing this for cuteness points. It is to stay in power. Besides, there is always something that could be auspicious. For instance, why wasn't the invasion date instead back in 2021, coinciding with the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party? Or why not wait until 2028 to celebrate Xi's 75th birthday? The point is, talk is cheap. So let's move past the unmeaningful declarations and get back to the nuts and bolts of this. Or rather, the lines on maps. Historically speaking, power transitions between major actors can lead to fraught times. Not everything ends as happily as the Japan case. Think about the current expected outcome and the PRC's costs, and then think about the future expected outcome and Taiwan's costs. For no bargain to be sustainable, it must be that the total power shift exceeds the actors' combined internalized costs of war. See? Like this. Otherwise, you would be able to find a compromise that works both now and into the future. For example, a deal here is better than war for the PRC today, and better than war for Taiwan later. And technically, war is not guaranteed even when the shift does not exceed the costs. In a marginal case like that one, Taiwan could be excessively conciliatory today to buy the PRC's tolerance now, knowing that later it could massively change the policy in its favor, once the mainland's demographics fall off and the PRC has no ability to stop the island. But for today, that is the type of minutia better saved for an academic textbook, or maybe the end of the video. Instead, let's interrogate the idea of low costs and big shifts. The last chapter focused on the PRC's problem with birth rates, but in truth, military power is not just a function of raw population. Otherwise, India would be a superpower. A country's economy also matters. You need surplus money to build weapons. More money, more weapons. In that regard, the PRC is still rising. It is a developing upper-middle income country, with gross national income per capita ranking between Bulgaria and Russia. In other words, there is still plenty of room for the CCP to observe further growth. Moreover, it is possible for an economy to still grow while the population declines, so long as workers are becoming sufficiently more productive. In contrast, Taiwan is one of the most highly developed countries and produces some of the most advanced technology in the world. Hold that thought for a minute. The key thing is that the PRC still has some relatively easy catching up to do that is not available to Taiwan. That is partly why the IMF projects for 2024 4.6% GDP growth for the PRC, compared to 2.6% for the island. However long that continues, the problem of demographic decline will not be as severe. Still, the concerns are present here. The days of 10% plus GDP growth, when fears in Washington of a rising China were strongest, are over. Much of the mainland's boom came from building infrastructure, which itself stimulates larger returns. That phase of Chinese growth is approaching its end, though, especially with the population now in decline. There is also the slight problem that a large portion of the funding model revealed itself to be a real estate bubble, which is further calling into question China's long-term trajectory. Actually, it is interesting how some Western observers cheered property developer Evergrande's collapse with a certain morbid glee. But if war will be the result of Beijing's waning military power, and economic growth is a counterbalance to its demographic troubles, then Evergrande was a force for peace, and its failure is a cause for concern. Meanwhile, the other half of the equation was the costs of war. Now, there are a lot of places that this conversation could turn to. One pathway is the Three Gorges Dam. It seems that much of the mass media discussion goes down this road because it leads to a ton of flashy implications. An environmental wasteland, the flooding of Shanghai, and tens of millions dead. Well, it is true that the dam is holding back a ridiculous amount of water. All in all, it would be a situation orders of magnitude worse than the Kakhovka Dam breach in Ukraine from 2023. But those discussions tend to gloss over how exactly Taiwan would send missiles all the way over to here unmolested by mainland defenses. It also ignores how gravity dams around the world work by just being gigantic slabs of concrete that are resistant to missile strikes. So let's move away from that clickbait and on to more pressing topics. Fewer sluices, and more suns, sanctions, and semiconductors. In another irony of the one-child policy, there is now an abundance of families with a single son who is expected to look after his aging parents. Sending him into battle is a good way to make a whole bunch of people nervous back home. Regarding sanctions, the other pillar of the Chinese economy is exports to developed countries. Beijing's two biggest customers are the European Union and the United States, each accounting for 14.8% of total exports. Neither would be pleased to see the PLA invade Taiwan, and thus those numbers would be at risk of vanishing overnight. But the most interesting aspect of the costs are semiconductors. Semiconductors are the raw ingredients that go into computers. If you are watching this video from anywhere in the world, it is almost certain that the tech you are using somehow traces back to Taiwan. You see, Taiwan accounts for 60% of the world's semiconductor production, and 90% of advanced semiconductor production. At the top of that food chain is the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, with an astounding $71.3 billion in revenue in 2023. It is therefore not surprising that TSMC produces 40% of the world's computing power. And maybe with a little bit more, we could get AI to produce a proper keyboard. Anyway, across the strait, Beijing has invested ungodly amounts of money into trying to move toward chip independence, but has stumbled at almost every step along the way. Consequently, China hawks often describe Taiwan's semiconductor industry as a modern-day vault full of bars of gold. That is, it is a prize to be taken once Beijing reintegrates the renegade island. If that is true, then semiconductors are pushing the parties to the brink of war. The problem is, that is not at all how things would play out. Where to begin? Let's go with sensitivity. Semiconductor fabrication is a very sensitive process. One misstep and the whole thing is ruined. As a case study, take the poor plight of Renesas, a major semiconductor manufacturer in Japan. 7.3 earthquake? Halt everything for a few days. Lightning strike on its facility? Shut it down for a week. Fire in the clean room? 4 weeks offline. At least it is not as embarrassing as a foil balloon costing a German fab to lose 24 hours. Also, everything about this article is amazing. Deflating hopes, demand is ballooning, supply is getting ballooned, foiling production plans, perpetrator not pictured. Seriously, Sebastian Moss, if you are watching this, I will have my say. You are a boss. Anyway, just imagine what explosions from a war would do. And it is not just blowing up power lines that would be a problem for the mainland's takeover. Direct sabotage is on the menu as well, and they have given this some forethought. Destroying a valuable prize as you retreat is a common practice in war. Images from Iraq setting fire to Kuwait's oil wells in 1991 is probably history's most striking example. And for semiconductors, it almost does not matter how fancy the sabotage plans are. Just equip an ex-president with a baseball bat, give her 5 minutes alone in a room like this one, and it will all be worthless afterward. You might also spend a quiet minute reflecting on how this is the Chinese Professional Baseball League, and what that says about the underlying conflict along the strait. In any case, chips go into military technology too, and so Taiwan would not want to let them fall into the enemy's hands. That also helps explain why evacuation is part of the game plan. The United States will need semiconductors to militarily counter China, and so evacuating the staff of fabrication plants to safer grounds is critical. Never mind that chip production is the backbone of the global economy. Remember all of those supply shortages during the pandemic, especially in the automotive sector? Much of that traces back to a slowdown in chip production in Taiwan. Taking Taiwan entirely out of the equation with no long-run replacement strategy would ravage the consumer market. Fortunately, the company that builds the fabs that TSMC operates is ASML, and if you will forgive the alphabet soup that I am creating, ASML is Dutch, and so it is feasible-ish to reset things in, say, Phoenix, hence the evacuation strategy. That last bit also hints at a problem that the PRC would face if it magically captured unharmed fabs. Producing semiconductors is a 6-step process, with a complicated global supply chain. First, you need electronic design automation software, which creates the blueprints for the chips. These companies tend to be concentrated in the United States. Second, you need the raw ingredients, like industrial chemicals, that go into the chips. These tend to be concentrated in Japan. Third, you need a company that manufactures the fabs. This is where ASML comes in. Fourth, you need to design the chips. Here we get to the companies that everyone has heard of. Fifth, you need to manufacture the chips. Finally, something that capturing TSMC equipment might actually help with. And lastly, you need to assemble the chips into the final products. At least the mainland can do this one already. But until China can figure out a solution to control all 6 steps, militarily capturing just this one means little. As for enslavement, for whoever is unlucky enough to miss the last helicopter out of Taiwan, Beijing will struggle to compel them to get back to work. By comparison, once upon a time, a conquering power could effectively enslave the loser's population to extract long-term rents. This was straightforward to do when the value production came from physical labor. For example, occupying soldiers could directly observe whether fields were being tended to, so when agriculture was the prize, this worked out well for the conquerors. In contrast, point a weapon at an employee in the semiconductor industry, and good luck figuring out whether they are doing anything right at all. It is just too easy to quietly break something in the process, leaving the occupier with no clear understanding of who is responsible. Zooming out, the general point here is that chip manufacturers in Taiwan are not a potential source of value for Beijing. Those bars of gold are not really there. Rather, because the mainland's economy is dependent on Taiwan's chip manufacturing, the whole semiconductor industry is a liability for Beijing. And once the manufacturers move to the United States and eventually restart production, you can bet that a silicon wall of sanctions will form along the Pacific. Thus, China's costs of war are rather large. But big enough to overcome the problem with the power shift? Well, I do not know. That is the type of nuance best left to the people actually getting the deepest intel on the subject. The point is, contrary to doom predictors, it is not obvious that a shift will cause war. As for us with this video, we probably could stop here. We have seen a pretty exhaustive overview of the conflict between the PRC and Taiwan. However, the problem is that another actor has loomed in the shadows this entire time, and they influence every last bit of the process. Chapter 7. Murica. Once upon a time, the United States shared a close military relationship with Taiwan. This was formalized by the Mutual Defense Treaty between the countries beginning in 1954. Think of it as NATO, but if NATO only had 2 members. Even Article 5 was still Article 5. US presidents might also visit the island and have parades thrown in their honor. In fact, the United States at one point stationed more than 19,000 troops there, armed with nuclear weapons for a good portion of the time. You see, this was the era of the Cold War. The mainland was communist, and the island was, well, far from a democracy, but importantly, not communist. Hence, Chiang Kai-shek received ample American support. By the middle of the 1960s, though, the Sino-Soviet split was in full swing, with Moscow and Beijing getting into disputes over the application of Marxist philosophy. The Nixon administration saw an opportunity to put more pressure on the Soviet Union by normalizing relations with Beijing. But that came at the expense of ties with Taiwan. In 1972, the United States adopted the aforementioned One China policy. As the decade further progressed, the Beijing-Washington ad hoc coalition against the Soviet Union further strengthened. Indeed, the Carter administration later terminated that Eisenhower-era defense pact with Taiwan. In its place came the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, which since then has dictated how the United States handles diplomatic affairs with the island. Notably, the text no longer uses the phrase Republic of China, but now prefers the term governing authorities on Taiwan and the people on Taiwan. Not of, on. Of would suggest that Taiwan itself was a polity, if not a state. On means that Taiwan in this case is referring to the island. That same year, the Stars and Stripes came down from the military installations, and the last US soldiers withdrew from Taiwan. In more recent decades, Washington's relationship with Taipei has been dominated by something called strategic ambiguity. There is no longer an official alliance relationship between the United States and Taiwan, just Hollywood stars and Star Wars references at the definitely not an embassy institute. Likewise, there no longer is an equivalent to NATO's Article 5 provision to trigger an intervention should Beijing initiate an invasion. And up until the Biden administration, the basic response to basic questions about what exactly the United States would do under those circumstances could be summarized as, I don't know. Simultaneously, the United States often acts like it wants to defend Taiwan. In essence, Washington is trying to thread the needle, deter Beijing from crossing the strait, while also convincing Taipei not to do anything provocative like declare independence. For the type of war that we have focused on in this video, there is little doubt that the United States would play a major role. Beijing and Washington have been engaging in an understated global power struggle for almost 3 decades now, what is sometimes described as Cold War II, with Taiwan serving as the new Berlin. But the reason for an intervention often focuses on the wrong motivation. It is true that the United States is heavily dependent on chips coming from the island, and thus Washington wants to protect Taiwan to the best of its abilities. But any serious invasion that lasts more than a short period is going to eradicate Taiwan's semiconductor industry anyway. This is part of the reason why strategic ambiguity exists. Washington really does not want Taipei to do anything that might provoke Beijing. The upshot for Taiwan is that the United States never saw the chip industry as a prerequisite for intervention. Indeed, back when formal ties between the two were the strongest, semiconductors were not yet a thing there. The industry only came to the island in 1974, and TSMC was not founded until 1987. And while saving the New Berlin comes with a certain amount of symbolism, the United States has a more practical reason to intervene. This is how we normally look at a map of China's coastline. North goes up, as cartographers prefer. But let's turn it like this for a second. I know it's weird, but bear with me. US partners inhabit what is called the First Island Chain and nearby regions. The PRC and Taiwan are here and here, of course. Then we have Japan and the Philippines, and to a lesser extent, South Korea. None of these countries officially recognize the Taiwanese government. In fact, very few do, and none of them are geopolitical power players. Guatemala is the largest of the bunch, and it is best known for bunches of bananas being one of its chief exports. And to further prove my point, I intentionally misspelled every single last one of those country names. How many of them did you notice? Silliness aside, the lack of diplomatic recognition does not reflect the true underlying preferences of China's neighbors. Rather, it is part of a grand bargain, one intended to dissuade the PRC from invading. There is less incentive for Beijing to try to make Taiwan its own, if very few officially say otherwise. Hooray, efficient negotiations. However, if war has started, then there is no need to continue extending the olive branch. It's already on fire. And all of those countries have an aligned interest in siding with Taiwan. To draw from history, if there is a modern-day analog to containment policy against the Soviet Union, this is it. Look closely at the water up here versus what it looks like down here. The different coloration reflects how the continental shelf drops off immediately past the First Island Chain. Feel free to dive right in. To wit, the Taiwan Strait itself has an average depth of only 61 meters. Strategically, this matters a great deal for our underwater friends. And no, not dolphins, cute as they are. Rather, I am talking about submarines. As long as American partners control the First Island Chain, and thus the shelf, the US Navy and its friends will have a relatively easy time monitoring the PRC's subs. But if the PRC were to capture Taiwan, then the coalition's containment perimeter would be breached. Chinese subs could immediately plunge down 13,000 feet just on the other side of the island. In contrast, if US partners maintain containment, the PRC either needs to accept US observation or take a longer trip this way and still likely be monitored. More on what's going on over there later. Consequently, we have a shifting power concern between these two, layered onto the shifting power concern that may start a war to begin with. In other words, if Washington does not commit to the fight when the war gets underway, it risks having to face a more dangerous threat later. Better to fight alongside Taiwan than deal with the consequences of an empowered Beijing. Chapter 8. How the United States would intervene. Now begins the guesswork of how exactly the United States would respond to a mainland attack on Taiwan. And as a hint, it probably will not be with these spears. Let's limit the discussion to first what would happen in the short run, and then what might happen if things stretch out to the long run. As a starting point, Beijing's initial problem will be overcoming a blockade that the United States could set up. Already, we have seen the containment zone around the First Island Chain. But an even deeper concern arises if we right our orientation and head south. Welcome to the Strait of Malacca, named for the Sultanate of Malacca that once ruled the region. It is one of the world's major naval choke points, up there with the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, and the Strait of Hormuz. But for the PRC, Malacca is a lifeline. Even if its population is shrinking, the mainland still has more than 1.4 billion people. To fuel that many humans, the PRC imports 11.3 million barrels of oil per day, with Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq as its chief exporters. Now, take a wild guess where all three want to ship their barrels of oil through. Yep, the Strait of Malacca. 80% of oil imported to mainland China first visits these waters. And you know who else likes to take fun strolls through the Strait of Malacca? Yep, the United States Navy. And because the strait goes down to less than 3 kilometers at its narrowest, it is a prime place to stage a blockade. Good luck to the PLA Navy trying to fight that blockade while also deploying ships to fight Taiwan. So, fine, Malacca gets closed. Surely Beijing can just reroute elsewhere. It might take a little longer and cost a little more, but no big deal, right? Well, let's zoom out. There are indeed a bunch of other options along Indonesia, but they are also narrow and easily blockaded. That leaves the long path, which involves going around Australia. Nothing wrong with a little down-under detour, right? Well, on second thought, better give it a wide berth. Australia would not be thrilled about the prospects of China splashing its weight around, and is liable to patrol the waters near its continent in support of a blockade. Okay, so China finally does navigate the outback. What now? Well, after that long journey, the ships ultimately end up here. But that leaves China with the earlier problem in reverse: how to penetrate into the first island chain. Oh, and lest you think that there is a yawning gap here, say hello again to Okinawa. Fittingly, the ship paying a visit is the USS America. Of course, Beijing is well aware of this strategic vulnerability, and the government has been taking actions to mitigate the problem. Green energy initiatives are not just a matter of cleaning up pollution in the city. They are also about taking one step closer to energy independence, though bear in mind that China's largest domestic oil reserves are in Xinjiang, which, you will recall, is the home of the Uyghurs, and thus might not be a portrait of stability come wartime. Failing that, Beijing has been working on land-borne pipelines that are blockade-proof, especially one that runs from the Kazakh coastline along the Caspian Sea to... oh, look at that, we're back in Xinjiang again. Or Beijing could wait until the Arctic Ocean melts, thereby allowing Russia to deliver oil from the north. Okay, maybe that option is a little bit too optimistic. For now, the mainland has a strategic petroleum reserve. The size of it is unknown, but the best guess is that it contains 40 to 50 days of oil. During a war, the PRC could stretch the supply by limiting civilian use, but rationing will only delay the problem, not solve it. This is further reason why, if Beijing ultimately wants a showdown with Taipei, it will want to steer clear of half measures. Simply blockading the island gives too much time to the United States and its partners to set up a counter-starvation strategy. Rather, the mainland's best hope is to go for the throat, miraculously capture the island in record time, and then issue a fait accompli to everyone else in the region. The battle is over, and thus there is no point in trying to overturn it, so just accept it and move on. That, incidentally, was Russia's plan for a 3-day special military operation in Ukraine. But Moscow went with a half measure, and so here we are today. This logic further suggests that Washington may not be even presented an option on whether to fight. You see, the United States needs ships to institute a blockade. If Beijing wants to roll the dice, then prior to a blockade forming, it could preemptively attack US assets in the region to cripple such an operation. An Asian power preemptively attacking the United States to reduce US naval assets, which could otherwise starve the attacker of its oil. Where have I heard that one before? Actually, the comparison to World War II provides a helpful segue to what might happen in the long run. As a part of its efforts to assist Ukraine, the United States has begun spinning up factories that have otherwise spent decades working below capacity. You may have heard this in regard to the all-important 155mm artillery shells. The problem is that, even with such updates, American manufacturing is not currently in a position to produce enough metal to win a long war. Worse, latent US capacity is also woefully inadequate. This is important because America's World War II strategy was to convert existing industrial capacity into a war machine. However, for almost a half-century, the sun has been slowly setting on US manufacturing, and, ironically, Americans watched as many of those jobs moved to China. It is no longer possible to spool things up as quickly as was the case in the 1940s. Now, Washington's problem has some okay solutions, particularly with some help from Mexico. But explaining how that would work would require a 20-minute tangent, so it is best reserved for its own video. Regardless, once produced, getting all of that metal to Taiwan will not be easy. We talked before about how the island presents logistical problems for a mainland invasion. Well, it cuts both ways. This is not a situation like Ukraine. For that war, the United States can just ship everything to Poland, drive it to the border with Ukraine, drop it off, and have Ukrainian troops take the stuff the final kilometer. That plan will not work with Taiwan, because the PLAN will try to surround the island. Any ship making a delivery would risk being sunk, and any plane trying to make a drop-off would risk being shot down. It will therefore be up to Taiwan to mostly defend itself, with the United States playing the support role. Suffice it to say that the United States is capable of causing great headaches to Beijing, but a wholehearted effort would require the biggest shift in domestic priorities since World War II. Chapter 9. The Nuclear Dimension. One element conspicuously absent from the discussion of war strategy is nuclear weapons. China has the third most nuclear weapons in the world at 500, while the United States ranks second at about 5,000. Or so we think. This is all secret stuff. In any case, if we take a single Dongfang 5 missile, featuring an intercontinental range equipped with a nuclear warhead, then send it express to New York City, we get about 324,584 dead. Oh, wait, I missed a zero. Oopsie. Meanwhile, a single W-87 warhead, also strapped to an ICBM, but now dropped on the center of Beijing, would yield about 708,860 dead. The difference is not American generosity, just a consequence of using bombs that generate smaller blast yields. Exact numbers aside, undoubtedly, if the PLA and American troops begin firing on one another, the world will be pushed to the edge. The whole thing will be reminiscent of the turbulence of the Cuban Missile Crisis, except that lasted 13 days, whereas this has the potential to stretch out much, much longer. But just because two states have nuclear weapons does not mean that they will use them when the shooting starts. Now, that does not mean I can guarantee there will be a nuclear peace, but it is telling that the US Navy is preparing for a drawn-out conflict, not for the fight to be decided in short order following a nuclear exchange. Why? Well, the irony of the situation is that one side using nuclear weapons invites nuclear retaliation from the other side. So, yes, a few million dead New Yorkers is a scary thought from the perspective of US policymakers. And, in a vacuum, that would provide a great deal of coercive leverage to Beijing. The problem is that a few million dead in Shanghai is also a scary thought from the perspective of Chinese policymakers, and thus the threat of retaliation deters the initial attack. Good old mutually assured destruction at work. Instead, nuclear weapons are best for limiting the scope of a conflict. Few doubt that the United States would be willing to use nuclear weapons if opposing troops begin marching on Washington Mall. At that point, facing a nuclear response, or even just all sorts of international condemnation would not matter. After all, the country would be on the verge of ceasing to exist anyway. This is how something like the Kargil War can happen. In 1999, Indian and Pakistani troops fought for almost 3 months over a portion of Kashmir. At no point did nuclear weapons come into play. You see, Kargil is here. It is not Islamabad, nor is it New Delhi. If the war had escalated to either of those locations, then we would be looking at a very different story. Likewise, the Soviet Union and China had 6 months of border skirmishes in 1969. Again, this did not amount to a nuclear confrontation, because the clashes occurred over a river-bound island in Manchuria and a lake in Kazakhstan next to Xinjiang, there it is again, and not in Beijing or Moscow. It is a similar story with Taiwan. Yes, technically during a meeting with the European Union in 2023, Beijing went on the record that the Taiwan question is the core interest of China's core interest. But not so fast. There is a big difference between core and core. Breaking news, leaders lie. Yes, Taiwan is relatively more central to interstate relations than Kargil is to India and Pakistan, or Sino-Soviet border regions. However, political claims to the contrary notwithstanding, no place is vital to core identity if it somehow skirts capital control for 3/4 of a century, and yet the mainland government continues to function without it. The PRC is not willing to sacrifice Beijing or Shanghai just because the United States is erecting barriers to invading Taiwan. Now, if the United States started thinking about marching troops onto the mainland, well, that would be a different story. But the thing is that Washington does not want to occupy Chinese territory, regardless of nuclear concerns. And the PRC is not about to land PLA troops across the Pacific. Actually, you know what? Put a pin in that until our next chapter. Anyway, given that troops are not making landfall, nuclear weapons are a background issue. Yes, there is always a low % chance that something might spin out of control during a crisis. That adds a non-trivial amount to the expected costs of war, which, as we discussed many chapters ago, is good for mitigating preventive war incentives. However, the main point here is that nuclear weapons will not radically alter what goes on here. Sure, the United States will have to think about escalation issues, such as whether it wants to target mainland ports, or wait for PLA and ships to get out to sea. But either way, nuclear weapons are not going to force the United States to sit out the war. Chapter 10: How to Stop a War. And now we reach the trillion-dollar question. What can be done to avoid the calamity? The idea of wars being fought to forestall power shifts is not a new idea. Nope, gotta go older. Even older than this. Yep, that's about right. We now find ourselves reading from Thucydides and his tale of how the Peloponnesian War was inevitable because of the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. Somewhere along the line, it became fashionable to pretend that we have not learned anything about preventive wars over the last 2,500 years. This headline says it all. But there are 3 clear solutions to the problem, and they call back the earlier chapter on the sanity check. Let's start with economic interdependence. Remember, the cost of war reflects not only fallen soldiers and destroyed property. It also covers the benefits normally accrued during peacetime that disappear come wartime. Specifically here, I am thinking about the gains from trade. The larger that they are, the costlier war is, and the more likely a stable settlement can exist. Thinking about Taiwan's bilateral relationship with the PRC for a second, we ought to return to semiconductors. Remember how blockading the Strait of Malacca would starve the mainland of its energy supplies, and how that would terrify Beijing? Well, in 2022, China imported a total of $360 billion in crude oil. In comparison, it imported $417 billion in chips. If Beijing is ever successful in onshoring semiconductor production, it removes a key benefit to keeping the peace. The United States quietly took a pair of critical measures in that regard on October 7, 2022, and October 17, 2023. These were a series of export controls, aimed to prevent the PRC from obtaining the precursor technology to construct advanced semiconductor fabs on the mainland. Beyond the more basic banning of the physical transport of goods, the measures also prohibited anyone with a US passport or green card from working with Chinese firms on the technology. I'll leave it at that, but if you want to know more, there's a very interesting book that focuses on that strategy. Anyway, the point is that if the PRC cannot produce its own semiconductors, and it cannot expropriate semiconductor fabs through an invasion, it is left purchasing them from Taiwan, and in the long run, perhaps more from the United States too. Either way, the restriction dissuades an invasion. But general trade restrictions on China are a riskier proposition. And at this point, I would like to pause our regularly scheduled video to tell a Hollywood story that perfectly encapsulates the main point here. In 1984, MGM released a relatively obscure movie called Red Dawn, perhaps historically most notable because it was the first film to be rated PG-13. It told the story of the Soviet Union invading North America, and a ragtag group of Colorado high school students who lead an insurgency to defeat the communists. America wins, hooray. Fast forward to 2012, and because even back then Hollywood had not had an original idea in decades, MGM decided to remake the film. One slight problem: the Soviet Union had disappeared 2 decades earlier, and the Russian successor state was not a plausible threat to invade North America. But this was around the height of US fears of a rising China, so producers replaced Moscow with Beijing. But another slight problem: for every one potential American moviegoer, there were about 3 potential Chinese moviegoers. And while I know this will come as a complete shock, Chinese film censors really did not like the idea of China being the bad guy. Consequently, in post-production, editors digitally altered and dubbed the entire film so that North Korea became the invaders. I will leave it to you to interpret what this means for Western audiences, who apparently were expected to not notice the difference. What is interesting about this whole saga, though, is that it captures exactly why the original China plotline was hard to believe. There is so much money to be made in their trade relationship, or at least noodles, that fighting a major war against one another does not make much sense. Now, it also does not make much sense how a country unable to power itself at night somehow has the power to invade the United States. But I suppose that the suspension of disbelief had to start somewhere. Moving past Hollywood and returning to our focus on dissuading Beijing from invading Taiwan, let's look at Chinese imports to the United States. Imports matter, of course, because they are the sales that the mainland risks foregoing in the event of war. In 2016, it was $462 billion. The first 2 years of the Trump administration saw increases, before dropping way off in 2019 and suffering further during the pandemic. Then there was a brief revitalization during Biden's first 2 years, but 2023 brought a new low, and 2024 is not trending any better. Trade sanctions with China will undoubtedly be a big part of the political discussion over the next 4 years. But it is worth remembering that every dollar that heads east is another reason to keep the peace. But now some caveats. Part of the PRC's plan to onshore production is to use the chips to improve its military. Insofar as that represents long-term power growth for the PRC, we have something that counteracts the mainland's demographics problem: resetting. The question becomes whether the cost increase dominates the foregone reduction in power shift. I will also throw out there that economic interdependence can cause war when states gamble on how much their opponents care about the issues at stake. See Russia and Germany as it relates to Ukraine. It is also possible that American dependency on Chinese trade would dissuade Washington from intervening, which in turn opens the door to an easier path toward an invasion. But that problem is complicated enough to warrant its own video at another time. The other straightforward solution is to mitigate the expected power shift over time, as we just saw. Do that, get peace. Easy. Well, maybe not. The main source of the power shift is faltering demographics over on the mainland, and that makes life difficult. For a comparison, let's go back to the nukes for a second. If a preventive war is about to trigger due to something like a nuclear weapons program, I have a simple solution to the problem. Maybe stop tinkering with the uranium? If no one expects you to do something like this anytime soon, then there is no need for a preventive attack. In contrast, it would be much harder for me to travel to the mainland and start telling the locals to have more babies. That ship has sailed. Heck, the government is already begging for more pregnancies, and it still is not working. Instead, the main Western efforts here have focused on tinkering with production capacity and military partnerships. Publicly, the basic discourse on this has been something along the lines of, Beijing wants to invade Taiwan, so let's make Taiwan stronger to resist an invasion. But remember, the cause of war is Taiwan being in a worse position today and a better position later. Once more, the difference is what matters. So doing things to improve the coalition's chances now is helpful. However, doing things that will improve the coalition's chances well into the future is counterproductive. Let me illustrate the tension using manufacturing capacity. When the Ukraine aid package passed in April 2024, part of what earned it bipartisan support was funding to improve that all-important arms production infrastructure discussed earlier. Now, there are two ways one could go about doing this. Option 1 is to flood the manufacturer's coffers immediately, well before Beijing is ready to stage an amphibious assault. Then, once the geopolitical threats have diminished, the support for high spending naturally subsides. Afterward, the West goes back to enjoying the peace dividend, just like when the Cold War ended. This is helpful because it makes any upcoming PLA attack on Taiwan less likely to succeed. And, in the long run, such a strategy for Beijing is unlikely to work anyway. The expected power shift therefore declines, because Taiwan's current strength is boosted, and any changes to what could happen later are small. Consequently, Beijing views preventive action as less attractive. Option 2 is to make it a slow burn. Why earmark the money today when you can defer it to some later date? Ah, yes, the kicking the can down the road approach, something that Washington loves to do. Sure, Congress can give manufacturers some small seed money to get going now, but the serious ramp-up will not occur until a later date. Well, now you are just making the problem worse. Today's military balance is not budging, but the future is becoming even more favorable to Taiwan. Now war may occur here because Beijing is scared about the long-term consequences of inaction. Thus, slow-burn weapons investment just compounds the existing problem. The other half of the formula is expanding the pro-Taiwan coalition. Two countries are focal to that effort: Japan and Vietnam. Japan's role is straightforward. The United States needs to use Japanese possessions to project power along the Chinese coastline. Shuttling to and from Guam will just not be an effective strategy. Doing this proactively is important because mid-invasion would not be a good time for Japan to get cold feet. Maybe the hot tea will help. Meanwhile, Vietnam is the missing link from the map reorientation from earlier. Indeed, Hanoi aligning with Taiwan's coalition would contain the PRC along another vector. This is also a big reason why the United States has an active effort to improve relations with Vietnam, with visits from successive administrations geared toward nudging the country westward. At stake today is the disputed Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. And going back further, there is no love lost between Beijing and Hanoi from their 1979 war, which, notably, was the last time that PLA troops had major combat experience. Ah, lack of seasoned troops. One more wrinkle to trying to invade Taiwan. And though US-Vietnamese relations come with its own baggage, okay, a lot of baggage, Hanoi views Beijing as the bigger threat today. But whether it is Japan, Vietnam, or otherwise, the timing of the enhanced relationship matters. If partners suddenly join up or strengthen their commitment, once again expectations about today's outcome versus later get squeezed. But if Beijing starts anticipating that the relationships will not fully form until years down the line, then we are back to the preventive war incentives. In fact, the expectation of an alliance forming is enough to trigger a war by itself. To substantively ground that idea, alliance prevention is a common explanation for the 2008 war between Georgia and Russia. A few months before the war, at its annual summit, NATO had begun looking into Georgia joining the alliance. Indeed, the summit's final declaration stated that Georgia would become a member, though no clear timetable was given. However, NATO has a provision that withholds new membership from countries with ongoing territorial disputes. It is a basic precautionary measure so that NATO countries do not get dragged into wars that do not serve the alliance's broader interests. But Putin was invited to that summit and positively could not believe what he was hearing. Moreover, NATO's own policy meant that as long as Vladimir Putin could keep Georgia's South Ossetia and Abkhazia autonomous regions an absolute mess, then NATO would not expand. And that is exactly what happened in 2008, when Russian troops went into those areas. The Kremlin has provided political support ever since. Thus, to summarize here, future expectation bad, immediate commitment good. The final piece of advice is for Taiwan to relax and play the long game. When the balance of power favors you in the long run, then every day that passes by is a small victory. Indeed, eventually the power shift will culminate, and at that point, Taiwan will have much greater latitude to choose the policy that it wants. In the meantime, if that requires being slightly more deferential to Beijing on forbidden policies, so be it. Better to make minor policy accommodations in the short run and get closer to your ideal outcome in the long run than face economic ruin right now. This is part of how East Germany ended up in NATO after the Cold War ended. Although the Kremlin allowed the Berlin Wall to fall without incident, Moscow was not exactly thrilled that East Germany was essentially dissolving into West Germany, and thus West Germany's much earlier membership into NATO would de facto extend to the previously East German territories. The way that the West solved the problem was by handing wads of cash over to the Soviet Union. This would not end the Soviet concerns related to NATO moving eastward, but that was a long-term issue made acceptable by mitigating the economic problems that the Soviet Union was facing at the time. Now, whether any of those strategies will stop a war from happening depends on just how big the problem is in the first place. But trying to find a solution to the problem will be the next major foreign policy conundrum for the rest of the decade. Goodness, you made it to the end. Well done. This is the longest thing that I have produced by a substantial margin. It's just that a full-blown war between the PRC and Taiwan would be the century-defining event, and those other 20-minute-long videos can't really cover the problem in a meaningful way. In any case, let me know what you think in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Take care.